Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We're going to discuss something that doesn't quite exist, and yet persists with remarkable tenacity across nearly a century of literary culture. The Necronomicon appears in no library catalog, no medieval scribe copied its verses, no Arabic scholar has authenticated its grammar. It is, by every objective measure, a fabrication, a prop invented by a Providence writer of weird fiction in 1924. And yet, the book has inspired criminal confessions, library hoaxes, and genuine scholarly debate. It has been translated multiple times, cited in academic papers with footnotes that lead nowhere, and sought by occultists who should know better. Its influence extends from pulp magazines through role-playing games to contemporary horror cinema. The Necronomicon has achieved something stranger than mere popularity. It has colonized the space between fiction and belief. This documentary examines that colonization. We'll trace the book's genesis in H.P. Lovecraft's correspondence and short fiction, analyze its function within cosmic horror's philosophical architecture, and document its remarkable afterlife as both literary device and cultural contagion. We're not asking whether the Necronomicon is real. We're asking why it needed to exist, and what it reveals about the stories we tell ourselves about forbidden knowledge. Howard Phillips Lovecraft began mentioning the Necronomicon in his letters around 1927, though the book's first published appearance came in The Hound, 1924. This timing matters. Lovecraft was not yet the recognized architect of cosmic horror he would become. He was a struggling pulp writer navigating the commercial demands of Weird Tales magazine, while developing a philosophical framework that would distinguish his work from conventional ghost stories. The Necronomicon emerged not as calculated world-building, but as practical solution to a recurring problem: how to suggest vast, inhuman knowledge without the tedium of exposition. Consider the literary landscape Lovecraft inhabited. The 1920s saw widespread fascination with Egyptology following Tutankhamun's tomb discovery in 1922, spiritualist movements claiming contact with ancient wisdom, and Theosophy's popularization of hidden masters and secret texts. Lovecraft, a materialist atheist with contempt for mysticism, nonetheless recognized the narrative power of forbidden books. But where occultists like Aleister Crowley treated their grimoires with deadly seriousness, Lovecraft approached his invention with scholarly distance, creating a book that functioned as literary device rather than mystical claim. The mechanics of invention reveal calculated restraint. Lovecraft never wrote the Necronomicon itself. He never provided extensive quotations or detailed chapter breakdowns. Instead, he offered fragments. A supposed author, the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, and Dapoisior's approximate composition date, 738 CE, translation history, Greek as Necronomicon, Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228, and carefully vague contents involving old ones and forbidden rites. This fragmentary approach proved crucial. By refusing to specify, Lovecraft created something more effective than any complete text could be: a void that invites projection. His correspondence shows deliberate myth-making. In letters to fellow writers, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and others, Lovecraft discussed the Necronomicon as if documenting folklore rather than inventing fiction. He encouraged others to reference the book in their own stories, creating cross-textual validation that mimicked scholarly citation. This collaborative approach transformed private invention into shared mythos. When multiple authors independently reference the same grimoire, readers encountered apparent evidence of the book's existence outside any single narrative. The philosophical motivation runs deeper than mere verisimilitude. Lovecraft's cosmicism, his conviction that humanity occupies no privileged position in an indifferent universe, required texts that predated human meaning-making. The Necronomicon supposedly documented entities and dimensions that existed before terrestrial life and would persist long after its extinction. The book thus served as narrative anchor for Lovecraft's central thesis that human knowledge systems are local, temporary, and cosmically irrelevant. A text claiming to transcend human perspective becomes, paradoxically, the ultimate expression of that perspective's limitations. We must pause here to acknowledge what Lovecraft was not doing. He was not creating scripture for devotees. He was not encoding hidden teachings. He was not, despite later claims, channeling genuine occult knowledge. His letters make this explicit. The Necronomicon existed to generate a convincing picture of cryptic lore and entities which actually never existed. The book was tool, not testament, a way to evoke cosmic scale without cosmic pretension. Yet intent and effect diverge. The Necronomicon's very fictitiousness became its strange authority. Because it claimed no actual mystical power, it paradoxically accumulated mystical reputation. Because Lovecraft never specified its contents, readers could populate it with their own apocalyptic visions. The book's absence became its presence. This transformation, from knowing fabrication to cultural phenomenon, begins with understanding not just what Lovecraft created, but what he deliberately left uncreated. The Necronomicon did not emerge from vacuum. Lovecraft drew upon a rich tradition of fictional grimoires, occult histories, and forbidden texts that stretched back centuries before his provident study. Understanding these antecedents reveals how his invention synthesized existing anxieties about dangerous knowledge into something distinctly modern, a text that functions less as magical manual and more as epistemological poison. The most direct literary ancestor appears in Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow, 1895. Chambers created a fictional play whose second act supposedly induced madness in anyone who read it. The text itself remains unwritten. Chambers provides only fragments and reported effects. This technique, suggesting content through consequence rather than quotation, became Lovecraft's primary method. Both authors understood that horror resides not in what forbidden texts contain, but in what they imply about reality's fragility. The difference lies in scale. Chambers' play drives individuals mad, while Lovecraft's tome threatens entire epistemological frameworks. Earlier still, we find Edgar Allan Poe's strategic references to non-existent books. In Ligeia, 1838, the narrator consults obscure volumes on metempsychosis. In The Fall of the House of Usher, 1839, Roderick's library contains invented titles alongside real ones. Poe's method created what we might call bibliographic uncanny, the disorientation that occurs when fictional texts occupy the same narrative space as historical ones. Lovecraft refined this technique by creating cross-references. His characters don't just read the Necronomicon, they cite specific editions, compare translations, and debate textual variants. This scholarly apparatus grants fictional books the weight of archival reality. The broader occult revival of the late 19th century provided cultural substrate. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in 1888, claimed access to secret wisdom transmitted through coded manuscripts. Madame Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, referenced Atlantean texts and Lemurian records that could never be verified. These movements popularized the idea that transformative knowledge existed just beyond normal channels, hidden in private collections, suppressed by authorities, or lost to catastrophe. Lovecraft, skeptical of all mysticism, nonetheless recognized the narrative power of this suppression mythology. Medieval grimoire tradition itself offered templates. The Key of Solomon, the Lesser Key of Solomon, and the Book of Abramelin circulated in manuscript form for centuries, accumulating layers of pseudonymous attribution and false history. These texts claimed impossible pedigrees, authorship by biblical kings, transmission through angelic contact, preservation by secret brotherhoods. Their actual origins remained deliberately obscure, a feature that enhanced rather than diminished their authority. Lovecraft understood this paradox. The less verifiable a text's provenance, the more mystique it accumulates. But Lovecraft's innovation involved philosophical shift rather than mere imitation. Traditional grimoires promised power, control over demons, spirits, or natural forces. The Necronomicon promises only knowledge, and knowledge of a specifically corrosive type. It doesn't teach how to command old ones. It reveals that humanity has never been in command of anything. This represents fundamental break from occult tradition, where magical texts elevated the practitioner above natural law. Lovecraft's tome demolishes the distinction between practitioner and victim. Consider also the influence of Lord Dunsany, whose fantasy stories featured imagined mythologies complete with their own sacred texts and prophetic books. Dunsany's The Gods of Pagana, 1905, invented an entire pantheon with its own cosmology, yet treated this invention with such consistency that readers approached it as recovered mythology rather than pure fabrication. Lovecraft admired this technique, but naturalized it, replacing Dunsany's whimsical gods with cosmic indifference and religious texts with scientific horror. The synthesis becomes clear. From Chambers, the unwritten text whose power lies in effects rather than content. From Poe, bibliographic verisimilitude through strategic citation. From occult movements, the romance of suppressed knowledge. From grimoire tradition, false attribution and impossible age. From Dunsany, mythological consistency and invented depth. Lovecraft combined these elements with his own materialist philosophy to create something genuinely new. A book that doesn't promise transcendence, but threatens it, not as elevation, but as annihilation of meaning itself. This foundation clarifies why the Necronomicon succeeded where other invented texts faded into footnotes. It arrived at the intersection of occult revival and modernist anxiety, offering a text that could satisfy both mystical yearning and philosophical dread. The book worked because it channeled genuine cultural currents while refusing to fully align with any of them. The name itself operates as deliberate puzzle. Necronomicon combines Greek roots, nekros, dead, nomos, law, and the suffix icon, pertaining to, suggesting something like concerning the laws of the dead, or an image of the law of the dead. Lovecraft claimed to have coined the term in a dream around 1927, waking with the word fully formed in his mind. Whether this origin story reflects genuine oniric experience or calculated myth-making hardly matters. What matters is the word's constructed authenticity. The etymology deliberately mimics genuine Greek compound formation while remaining slightly wrong. Classical scholars note that a more accurate Greek construction would be necronomikao or necronomos. This near correctness proves strategically effective. The title sounds plausibly ancient without being verifiably so. It occupies the space between linguistic legitimacy and obvious fabrication. This ambiguity mirrors the book's entire function, not quite real, not quite impossible, existing in the productive uncertainty between categories. Lovecraft provided an alternative title, Al-Azif. He claimed this represented the original Arabic name, supposedly referring to nocturnal insect sounds that Arabs superstitiously attributed to demons. The word appears in no Arabic lexicon. Lovecraft possessed minimal Arabic knowledge and likely constructed the term from phonetic intuition rather than linguistic research. Yet the invention succeeded precisely through its wrongness. Al-Azif sounds sufficiently alien to English speakers while maintaining pronounceability. It occupies the acoustic space where genuine Arabic terms reside in Anglophone imagination. The supposed author's name demonstrates similar construction. Abdul al-Hazred combines the common Arabic name component, Abdul, servant of, with al-Hazred, which Lovecraft later admitted derived from all has read, a childhood nickname reflecting his voracious reading habits. This playful etymology reveals the Necronomicon's dual nature, simultaneously serious literary device and private joke. The Mad Arab exists as both convincing historical fiction and transparent fabrication, depending on how closely one examines the construction. Translation history adds further layers of symbolic meaning. According to Lovecraft's invented chronology, the text passed from Arabic through Greek, translated by Theodorus Philetus in 950 CE, to Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228, before reaching English. Each translation supposedly corrupted or concealed elements of the original, creating a textual tradition marked by loss and distortion. This mirrors actual medieval manuscript culture, where texts accumulated errors, interpolations, and deliberate alterations across centuries of transmission. The Necronomicon's fictional bibliography thus reflects genuine anxieties about textual authority and interpretive certainty. The symbolic language within the text, or rather, the language Lovecraft attributes to the text in fragments throughout his fiction, follows consistent patterns. Incantations appear in no recognizable tongue, but maintain phonetic coherence. Finglui mglunaf Cthulhu relie ugahnagel ftagen. These constructions employ consonant clusters that defy normal English, phonotactics while remaining speakable. The effect suggests language that precedes or bypasses human linguistic evolution, communication that exists outside the structures that make human meaning possible. Lovecraft understood that authentic-seeming invented languages require internal consistency without actual grammatical structure. His approach differs markedly from constructed languages like Tolkien's Elvish, which possess complete grammatical systems. The languages associated with the Necronomicon and its cosmic entities remain deliberately incomplete. They gesture toward systematic meaning while refusing to crystallize into it. This incompleteness serves thematic purpose. These are languages that human minds cannot fully process without damage. Consider how naming functions throughout Lovecraft's invented mythology. Entities possess multiple names: Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, none of which sound human. These names don't translate. They approximate sounds that exist beyond human phonetic range. The Necronomicon supposedly provides these names, but naming in this context doesn't grant power as it does in traditional magical systems. Instead, naming represents dangerous recognition, the ability to conceptualize what should remain unrecognized. The book's language doesn't control cosmic forces. It merely makes them linguistically accessible, with accessibility itself constituting the primary threat. The symbolism extends to how the text is described physically. Lovecraft references various editions: the Greek Necronomicon, the Latin translation, even a German version, Necronomicon translated by Gottfried von Junst, itself a fictional creation of Robert E. Howard's. These editions appear in different states, heavily annotated, suspiciously pristine, damaged by fire or water. The physical book becomes symbol for knowledge that cannot be safely transmitted. Even the medium carrying the information proves unstable, as if material reality itself resists the text's existence. This symbolic architecture reveals Lovecraft's core innovation. Where traditional grimoires used obscure language to conceal power from the uninitiated, the Necronomicon uses obscure language to represent the fundamental obscurity of cosmic reality. Its etymology is wrong because human language systems cannot accurately describe pre-human or post-human phenomena. Its translations multiply errors because truth degrades in the process of human comprehension. Its names sound alien because they designate entities genuinely alien to human categories of thought. The book's language doesn't hide meaning. It demonstrates that some meanings exist beyond the capacity of human linguistic systems to capture. The transformation of private invention into public mythology required deliberate architecture. Lovecraft didn't simply write stories featuring the Necronomicon. He constructed an apparatus of authenticity around it: false histories, contradictory accounts, scholarly disputes, and cross-references that mimicked genuine textual scholarship. This myth-building process reveals how fictional elements achieve cultural persistence through techniques borrowed from folklore, academic discourse, and collaborative world-building. The foundational strategy involved bibliographic specificity. Lovecraft didn't mention the Necronomicon vaguely. He provided precise publication details. The Greek translation by Theodorus Velitas supposedly appeared in 950 CE. Olaus Wormius translated it into Latin in 1228. The Latin edition was printed in Germany in the 15th century, the Black Letter edition, and in Spain in the 17th century. These dates anchor the fictional text in real historical periods, creating temporal verisimilitude. The technique exploits a basic epistemological principle. Specific details feel more credible than vague ones, even when both are equally fictional. Lovecraft extended this approach by situating copies in real institutions. He claimed that only 5 copies of the Latin edition survived: one at the British Museum, one at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, one at Widener Library at Harvard, one at the University of Buenos Aires, and one at Miskatonic University, his own fictional creation. This mixture of real and invented locations proves crucial. The British Museum and Harvard exist. Readers can theoretically verify their collections. Miskatonic doesn't exist, but its inclusion alongside genuine institutions grants it borrowed credibility. The overall effect suggests that the book exists just beyond easy verification, plausibly real, but conveniently inaccessible. The collaborative expansion transformed private joke into shared mythos. Lovecraft actively encouraged fellow writers to reference the Necronomicon in their own stories. Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Robert Bloch, and August Derleth all incorporated the tome into their fiction, each adding details that enriched the mythology. This cross-pollination created what we might call distributed authentication. When multiple authors independently reference the same text, it acquires the appearance of established fact rather than individual invention. The technique mirrors how genuine folklore develops, through iterative retellings that gradually accumulate authority. Consider the role of contradiction in building authenticity. Different stories provide incompatible details about the Necronomicon's contents, structure, or history. Some describe it as massive tome, others as modest volume. Accounts differ on whether it contains illustrations, charts, or purely textual content. These inconsistencies don't undermine the mythology, they strengthen it. Real texts accumulate contradictory descriptions across centuries of transmission. Multiple variant editions exist. Scholars dispute details. By incorporating contradiction, Lovecraft replicated the textual confusion that surrounds genuine historical documents. The invention of scholarly apparatus proved particularly effective. Lovecraft created not just the Necronomicon, but an entire academic discourse surrounding it. His stories reference fictional scholars who study the text: Dr. Laban Shrewsbury, Professor Gordon Whitney, various unnamed antiquarians. These characters debate textual variants, compare translations, and argue about interpretation. This meta-level invention, creating the scholarly community that studies the fictional text, adds remarkable depth. The book becomes real not just through its supposed existence, but through the accumulated intellectual labor supposedly devoted to understanding it. Lovecraft's correspondence functioned as crucial myth-building space. In letters, he discussed the Necronomicon with the casual authority of someone documenting established fact rather than inventing fiction. He provided etymological explanations, clarified chronology, and corrected misunderstandings. This shift in register, from fictional narrative to apparent scholarly clarification, performed sophisticated ontological work. When an author explains their invention as if it were historical research, the boundary between creation and discovery deliberately blurs. The strategy also involved calculated restraint. Lovecraft never published the Necronomicon itself. No complete manuscripts appeared in his lifetime. He resisted the temptation to provide extensive quotations or detailed chapter breakdowns. This absence proved essential. By leaving the text largely undescribed, Lovecraft created something more powerful than any written book could be, an absence that invites imaginative completion. Readers could project their own apocalyptic visions onto the void. The book's non-existence became its defining characteristic. We see parallel techniques in how Lovecraft handled related texts. The Pnakotic manuscripts, the Book of Eibon, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, supposedly by Friedrich von Junst, each received similar treatment. Brief mentions, specific details, scholarly references, but no complete texts. This multiplication of sources created a fictional bibliography that gained credibility through interconnection. These texts cited each other, confirmed each other's claims, and built toward a coherent, if horrifying, cosmology. The mythology expanded horizontally rather than vertically, more sources rather than deeper documentation of any single source. The choice of the grimoire format itself carried strategic advantages. Grimoires historically circulated in manuscript form, passed between practitioners, suppressed by authorities, and lost to time. They existed in states of textual instability, multiple versions, uncertain authorship, contested authenticity. By situating his invention within this tradition, Lovecraft inherited centuries of established ambiguity. The Necronomicon could be simultaneously real, as grimoires are real historical artifacts, and fictional, as grimoires often contain fabricated histories and false attributions. The genre itself operated in the space between fact and fantasy. Perhaps most significantly, Lovecraft's myth-building anticipated participatory culture. By explicitly inviting other writers to use his creation, he pioneered what we now recognize as open-source world-building. The Necronomicon became collaborative fiction decades before fan communities and shared universes dominated popular culture. This openness allowed the mythology to evolve beyond any single creator's control, accumulating details and variations that no individual author could have generated. The book achieved authenticity through collective imagination. It became real because enough people agreed to treat it as real within fictional contexts. The result was literary sleight of hand, operating at multiple levels simultaneously. The Necronomicon functioned as narrative device within stories, as shared reference point among writers, as inside joke among correspondents, and as gradually accruing cultural artifact. Each level of operation reinforced the others. The mythology worked because it never committed fully to any single ontological status. It remained productively ambiguous, existing in the spaces between categories where myths traditionally reside. The Necronomicon functions as philosophical instrument before it functions as narrative device. Its central purpose involves demonstrating humanity's cosmic irrelevance through accumulated evidence of older, vaster, and fundamentally indifferent realities. This isn't horror of physical threat. It's horror of ontological displacement. The book doesn't promise that monsters will destroy humanity. It reveals that humanity never occupied the central position in cosmic drama that our mythologies assume. Lovecraft termed his worldview cosmicism, distinguishing it from nihilism through subtle but crucial difference. Nihilism suggests absence of meaning. Cosmicism suggests presence of meanings that have nothing to do with human concerns. The universe contains vast significance, just none that acknowledges or values terrestrial life. The Necronomicon supposedly documents these alien systems of meaning, geometries that predate Euclidean space, chronologies that transcend linear time, and entities whose existence renders human categories obsolete. The book's horror lies not in what it describes, but in the implications of description being possible at all. Consider the concept of scale that pervades references to the text. The Necronomicon describes entities that existed before Earth's formation and will persist after its dissolution. It references cycles measured in eons, not centuries. It documents civilizations that rose and fell while humanity's ancestors were still single-celled organisms. This temporal vastness serves specific philosophical purpose. It positions human history as momentary flicker within incomprehensible duration. When Lovecraft's characters read the Necronomicon, they encounter evidence that everything they consider permanent, consciousness, civilization, even planetary existence, represents temporary anomaly. The book's treatment of knowledge itself inverts Enlightenment assumptions. Western intellectual tradition treats knowledge as progressive accumulation, leading toward mastery and control. The Necronomicon presents knowledge as regression. Each revelation strips away comforting illusions without offering empowering replacement. Learning what the old ones are doesn't grant power over them. It merely clarifies the futility of human aspiration. This represents epistemological poison, information that damages the knower without providing compensatory utility. Dream reality constitutes another recurring theme. The Necronomicon supposedly blurs distinctions between waking and dreaming, suggesting both states represent equally valid but incompatible frameworks for interpreting reality. In Lovecraft's cosmology, dreams aren't subconscious, fantasy. They're alternative access points to dimensions that exist parallel to mundane reality. The book allegedly contains techniques for navigating these dream dimensions, but navigation implies no control. Dreamers encounter entities and spaces that preceded human imagination and will continue after it. The horror involves recognizing that what we dismiss as dream might possess independent existence beyond psychological projection. Entropy threads through the mythology at multiple levels. The Necronomicon describes universe winding down toward final heat death, but with twist. Consciousness itself represents temporary resistance to this universal decay, and that resistance provokes cosmic attention. The old ones exist as something like entropy made conscious, not malevolent, but fundamentally alien to the organizing principles that make life possible. The book's forbidden knowledge involves understanding that order, meaning, and consciousness are local exceptions to cosmic rule of dissolution. This frames human existence not as tragic, which implies meaning through suffering, but as cosmically negligible, a brief complication in matter's return to equilibrium. What distinguishes the Necronomicon from traditional apocalyptic texts? Revelation, whether biblical or occult, typically promises disclosure of hidden purpose, suffering explained, justice deferred but guaranteed, cosmic accounting that balances scales. The Necronomicon offers revelation without redemption or purpose. It reveals that the universe operates according to principles utterly indifferent to justice, meaning, or human survival. This makes it modernist horror, not fear of punishment or damnation, but fear that the categories through which we understand punishment and damnation might be purely local, limited, and ultimately irrelevant. The philosophical implications extend to consciousness itself. If the Necronomicon's accounts prove accurate, then human awareness represents accident rather than achievement, a temporary configuration of matter that happened to develop self-reflection without cosmic significance. We're not fallen angels or evolving spirits. We're pattern recognition systems complex enough to recognize patterns, but not complex enough to recognize that our pattern recognition produces no privileged access to truth. The book thus performs double operation. It claims to reveal cosmic truth while simultaneously undermining the possibility that any text, including itself, could reliably transmit such truth through human cognitive apparatus. This paradox explains the Necronomicon's enduring power. It promises ultimate knowledge while insisting that ultimate knowledge would destroy the knower. It offers cosmic perspective while suggesting that cosmic perspective exceeds human conceptual capacity. The book exists as both key and warning. It opens doors that perhaps should remain closed, not because what lies beyond threatens physical survival, but because it threatens the conceptual frameworks that make human meaning possible. The Necronomicon catalogs entities that resist conventional categorization as gods, demons, or monsters. Lovecraft termed them Old Ones, a designation deliberately vague enough to accommodate beings whose nature exceeds human taxonomic systems. These entities don't serve narrative function as antagonists in any traditional sense. They aren't evil, merely other. Their relationship to humanity resembles humanity's relationship to microorganisms. Occasional intersection without meaningful engagement or moral consideration. Cthulhu stands as the most recognized entity associated with the text. The Necronomicon supposedly describes this being as priest or representative of the Old Ones, currently entombed in the sunken city of Relia, somewhere in the South Pacific. What makes Cthulhu philosophically significant isn't his tentacled appearance or immense size. It's his temporal relationship to human existence. He predates humanity, lies dormant through human history, and will eventually wake regardless of human action or desire. This temporal structure positions human civilization as brief interval between ages of inhuman dominance. The text allegedly describes Azathoth as something like primordial chaos given consciousness, or perhaps consciousness reduced to its most basic, mindless form. Lovecraft called him the blind idiot god and situated him at the center of ultimate chaos, surrounded by flute-playing entities maintaining reality through their music. This image inverts traditional theological hierarchies, where monotheistic traditions place intelligent, purposeful divinity at cosmic center. The Necronomicon places mindless, purposeless chaos. Existence itself becomes accident maintained by meaningless ritual rather than deliberate creation sustained by divine will. Yog-Sothoth represents different horror, the horror of totality rather than chaos. The Necronomicon describes this entity as coterminous with all space and time, simultaneously existing at every point in history and every location in the universe. This makes Yog-Sothoth something like pantheistic god stripped of benevolence or personality. The entity knows everything because it is everything, but this omniscience implies no interest in human affairs. Knowledge without care, presence without attention, these qualities define cosmic indifference at its most complete. The book supposedly documents lesser entities as well, though lesser proves relative term. The deep ones represent amphibious humanoids dwelling in ocean depths, worshipping Cthulhu, and occasionally breeding with humans in coastal settlements. Their horror lies not in monstrosity, but in implication. They suggest that human evolutionary boundaries remain porous, that identity itself might be negotiable, and that what we consider human nature might be temporary biological configuration, subject to revision. The Necronomicon, allegedly, contains genealogies tracing hybrid bloodlines, undermining species distinction at genetic level. Nyarlathotep differs from other entities through apparent consciousness and deliberate interaction with humanity. The text describes him as messenger, or soul of the old ones, taking various forms to manipulate human civilizations toward purposes that remain obscure. This makes Nyarlathotep uniquely disturbing. Where other entities ignore humanity, he engages with it, but engagement without empathy produces horror more profound than simple indifference. He recognizes human consciousness sufficient to exploit it, but assigns it no intrinsic value. We matter enough to be used, not enough to be considered. The Dreamlands entities occupy ambiguous ontological space. The Necronomicon supposedly describes regions accessible only through sleep, populated by beings that exist independent of human dreaming. Lovecraft developed this mythology across multiple stories, creating geography of dream realms complete with cities, trade routes, and political structures. These aren't psychological spaces. They're parallel dimensions where consciousness itself takes different forms. The cats of Ulthar, the ghouls beneath graveyards, the moon beasts that sail between worlds, each suggests that dream represents access point to genuine realities operating according to non-terrestrial logic. What unifies these varied entities? They share temporal priority and ontological independence from humanity. The Necronomicon doesn't describe beings created by human imagination or sustained by human belief. These entities existed before human consciousness evolved and will persist after it vanishes. This temporal structure proves essential to Cosmic Horror's philosophical project. It positions humanity as recent arrival in cosmos already crowded with inhuman presences who possess no interest in our continued survival. The book's treatment of these entities refuses anthropomorphization. Traditional mythology and theology attribute human characteristics to gods and monsters, emotion, intention, moral frameworks. The Necronomicon's entities possess none of these features in forms humans would recognize. Cthulhu doesn't hate humanity. Hatred requires emotional investment. Humanity doesn't warrant. Azathoth doesn't create or destroy purposefully. These concepts presume intentionality foreign to its nature. Even Nyarlathotep's manipulations serve purposes so alien that calling them plans imposes human conceptual framework on something fundamentally other. This otherness extends to how the entities interact with physical reality. The Necronomicon supposedly describes geometries that permit their existence, non-Euclidean spaces where conventional physics breaks down. R'lyeh's architecture features impossible angles that hurt human perception. Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, represents fertility principles so alien that reproduction itself becomes cosmic horror. These aren't metaphors for human anxiety. They're attempts to describe entities whose existence requires different mathematical and physical laws than those governing terrestrial life. The Necronomicon's function involves providing linguistic and conceptual frameworks for acknowledging these entities. It doesn't grant power over them. Control presumes commensurability impossible between human and cosmic scales. Instead, the text offers something more disturbing: recognition. It allows humans to perceive what normally remains imperceptible, to conceptualize what exceeds conceptualization. This makes the book dangerous, not because it summons entities, but because it removes cognitive protections that keep humanity safely ignorant. The entities were always there. The Necronomicon simply makes their presence intellectually accessible, with accessibility itself constituting primary threat. The relationship between humans and the Necronomicon follows consistent pattern across Lovecraft's fiction: acquisition, study, revelation, and dissolution. This trajectory isn't mere plot structure. It represents philosophical argument about consciousness confronting information it cannot process. Madness in these narratives functions not as disease, but as inevitable consequence of incompatible epistemologies colliding. Characters who engage with the Necronomicon typically arrive through scholarly pursuit rather than occult ambition. They're archaeologists, antiquarians, linguists, individuals trained in rational inquiry who approach the text as historical document rather than magical grimoire. This matters because it positions the horror as consequence of legitimate intellectual investigation, not punishment for transgressive curiosity. The book doesn't corrupt pure minds. It reveals information that no mind, however disciplined, can safely integrate into coherent worldview. Consider the trajectory in The Dunwich Horror, 1929. Dr. Armitage at Miskatonic University encounters the Necronomicon while researching local folklore. His investigation reveals that certain Massachusetts families maintain genetic connections to inhuman entities documented in the text. The horror escalates not through supernatural attack, but through recognition. The boundary between human and non-human proves more permeable than biological categories suggest. Armitage's response isn't simple fear. It's ontological vertigo produced by evidence that human identity lacks the stability Western thought presumes. The madness that afflicts Necronomicon readers manifests as cognitive collapse rather than psychological dysfunction. Characters don't become irrational. They become unable to maintain the rational frameworks that structure everyday experience. Time stops feeling linear. Space loses its Euclidean stability. The distinction between self and environment blurs. These aren't hallucinations. They're shifts in perception that might actually be more accurate than consensus reality. The horror involves possibility that madness represents clearer vision rather than distorted one. Lovecraft's treatment of madness inverts traditional associations between knowledge and sanity. Enlightenment thinking positions knowledge as route to mental health. Understanding produces control. Control produces stability. The Necronomicon demonstrates opposite principle. Certain knowledge produces instability precisely because it reveals that control was always illusory. Characters who read the book don't lose their minds. They lose the protective fictions that made human meaning possible. What we call sanity might be a sophisticated form of strategic ignorance. The physical effects described in various stories prove significant. Characters report dreams that feel more real than waking life, sensory distortions where angles seem wrong, temporal disorientation where past and future bleed into present. These symptoms suggest that consciousness itself operates within narrow parameters, and exposure to information about broader reality strains cognitive apparatus beyond functional limits. The brain evolved to navigate terrestrial environments and social relationships, not to conceptualize cosmic immensity. Confronting such immensity damages the organ attempting comprehension. We see social dimension to this madness as well. Characters who have encountered the Necronomicon become isolated not through choice, but through inability to communicate their experience. Language evolved to describe human-scale phenomena. It fails when applied to cosmic-scale realities. This creates profound loneliness, the isolation of knowing things that cannot be adequately expressed to others. The book transforms readers into involuntary mystics, possessing gnosis they can neither share nor forget. The text also documents hereditary effects. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1936, the Necronomicon helps explain how entire families maintain genetic connections to deep ones across generations. This suggests that contact with cosmic entities can produce permanent biological changes that propagate through bloodlines. Madness becomes not individual affliction, but familial legacy, knowledge transmitted through genetics as well as text. The horror here involves recognizing that some forms of awareness might be literally inherited, impossible to avoid through simple ignorance. Lovecraft's characters rarely use the Necronomicon for instrumental purposes. They don't attempt to summon entities or gain power. Their interaction remains predominantly observational. They read, they learn, they understand. This passivity proves crucial. It means the horror doesn't come from meddling with forces beyond human control. It comes from simply knowing those forces exist. The book's danger lies in information itself, not in any ritual application of that information. This makes the threat inescapable. Once read, the knowledge cannot be unlearned. The trajectory toward dissolution takes various forms. Some characters withdraw from society, unable to maintain normal social interaction after recognizing its cosmic futility. Others become obsessed, dedicating remaining life to further research, despite knowing it will accelerate their deterioration. A few attempt to warn others, though their warnings typically sound like ravings. The common element involves fundamental break between the person who read the Necronomicon and the consensus reality that person formerly inhabited. They haven't left our world for another. They've simply become unable to pretend our world is all that exists. This treatment of human interaction with forbidden knowledge reveals Lovecraft's core philosophical position. Consciousness represents both achievement and vulnerability. Our capacity for abstract thought allows us to contemplate cosmic immensity, but that same capacity makes us susceptible to being overwhelmed by what we contemplate. The Necronomicon functions as test of cognitive limits. It presents information at the threshold of human comprehensibility and demonstrates what happens when that threshold is crossed. The madness isn't failure of character or intellect. It's structural limitation of human consciousness, encountering data it wasn't designed to process. The relationship between humans and the Necronomicon follows consistent pattern across Lovecraft's fiction: acquisition, study, revelation, and dissolution. This trajectory isn't mere plot structure. It represents philosophical argument about consciousness confronting information it cannot process. Madness in these narratives functions not as disease, but as inevitable consequence of incompatible epistemologies colliding. Characters who engage with the Necronomicon typically arrive through scholarly pursuit rather than occult ambition. They're archaeologists, antiquarians, linguists, individuals trained in rational inquiry who approach the text as historical document rather than magical grimoire. This matters because it positions the horror as consequence of legitimate intellectual investigation, not punishment for transgressive curiosity. The book doesn't corrupt pure minds. It reveals information that no mind, however disciplined, can safely integrate into coherent worldview. Consider the trajectory in The Dunwich Horror, 1929. Dr. Armitage at Miskatonic University encounters the Necronomicon while researching local folklore. His investigation reveals that certain Massachusetts families maintain genetic connections to inhuman entities documented in the text. The horror escalates not through supernatural attack, but through recognition. The boundary between human and non-human proves more permeable than biological categories suggest. Armitage's response isn't simple fear. It's ontological vertigo produced by evidence that human identity lacks the stability Western thought presumes. The madness that afflicts Necronomicon, readers manifest as cognitive collapse rather than psychological dysfunction. Characters don't become irrational. They become unable to maintain the rational frameworks that structure everyday experience. Time stops feeling linear. Space loses its Euclidean stability. The distinction between self and environment blurs. These aren't hallucinations. They're shifts in perception that might actually be more accurate than consensus reality. The horror involves possibility that madness represents clearer vision rather than distorted one. Lovecraft's treatment of madness inverts traditional associations between knowledge and sanity. Enlightenment thinking positions knowledge as route to mental health. Understanding produces control. Control produces stability. The Necronomicon demonstrates opposite principle. Certain knowledge produces instability precisely because it reveals that control was always illusory. Characters who read the book don't lose their minds. They lose the protective fictions that made human meaning possible. What we call sanity might be a sophisticated form of strategic ignorance. The physical effects described in various stories prove significant. Characters report dreams that feel more real than waking life. Sensory distortions where angles seem wrong. Temporal disorientation where past and future bleed into present. These symptoms suggest that consciousness itself operates within narrow parameters, and exposure to information about broader reality strains cognitive apparatus beyond functional limits. The brain evolved to navigate terrestrial environments and social relationships, not to conceptualize cosmic immensity. Confronting such immensity damages the organ attempting comprehension. We see social dimension to this madness as well. Characters who've encountered the Necronomicon become isolated not through choice, but through inability to communicate their experience. Language evolved to describe human-scale phenomena. It fails when applied to cosmic-scale realities. This creates profound loneliness, the isolation of knowing things that cannot be adequately expressed to others. The book transforms readers into involuntary mystics, possessing gnosis they can neither share nor forget. The text also documents hereditary effects. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the 1936, the Necronomicon helps explain how entire families maintain genetic connections to deep ones across generations. This suggests that contact with cosmic entities can produce permanent biological changes that propagate through bloodlines. Madness becomes not individual affliction, but familial legacy, knowledge transmitted through genetics as well as text. The horror here involves recognizing that some forms of awareness might be literally inherited, impossible to avoid through simple ignorance. Lovecraft's characters rarely use the Necronomicon for instrumental purposes. They don't attempt to summon entities or gain power. Their interaction remains predominantly observational. They read, they learn, they understand. This passivity proves crucial. It means the horror doesn't come from meddling with forces beyond human control. It comes from simply knowing those forces exist. The book's danger lies in information itself, not in any ritual application of that information. This makes the threat inescapable. Once read, the knowledge cannot be unlearned. The trajectory toward dissolution takes various forms. Some characters withdraw from society, unable to maintain normal social interaction after recognizing its cosmic futility. Others become obsessed, dedicating remaining life to further research, despite knowing it will accelerate their deterioration. A few attempt to warn others, though their warnings typically sound like ravings. The common element involves fundamental break between the person who read the Necronomicon and the consensus reality that person formerly inhabited. They haven't left our world for another. They've simply become unable to pretend our world is all that exists. This treatment of human interaction with forbidden knowledge reveals Lovecraft's core philosophical position. Consciousness represents both achievement and vulnerability. Our capacity for abstract thought allows us to contemplate cosmic immensity, but that same capacity makes us susceptible to being overwhelmed by what we contemplate. The Necronomicon functions as test of cognitive limits. It presents information at the threshold of human comprehensibility and demonstrates what happens when that threshold is crossed. The madness isn't failure of character or intellect. It's structural limitation of human consciousness encountering data it wasn't designed to process. The concept of forbidden knowledge operates differently in Lovecraft's framework than in traditional religious or moral contexts. Biblical tradition forbids knowledge because it leads to sin. Promethean myth warns against stealing divine prerogatives. Faustian narratives punish intellectual overreach. The Necronomicon presents knowledge as forbidden, not because acquisition violates moral law, but because certain information inherently destabilizes the cognitive structures required to process it. This represents epistemological rather than ethical prohibition. What makes knowledge dangerous in this schema? The Necronomicon supposedly contains accurate descriptions of cosmic reality, and accuracy itself constitutes the threat. Human consciousness evolved to navigate local environments, interpret social cues, and maintain biographical continuity across decades. These adaptive functions require stable frameworks, consistent physical laws, reliable cause-effect relationships, coherent personal identity. The book describes realities where these frameworks don't apply, space curves in ways that violate Euclidean geometry. Time flows non-linearly. Identity proves porous rather than discrete. This information isn't false. It's incompatible with the cognitive architecture attempting to understand it. The epistemic collapse follows predictable pattern. Initial exposure produces intellectual excitement, the thrill of discovering hidden truths that reframe ordinary experience. This phase mimics genuine scholarly breakthrough, where new paradigms suddenly clarifies previously confused phenomena. But continued engagement reveals a problem. Each answer generates questions that undermine the conceptual foundation supporting inquiry itself. Why does R. Lié's geometry hurt perception? Because human visual processing evolved for terrestrial environments. Why do old ones seem to exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously? Because three-dimensional frameworks inadequately describe their actual nature. The questions demonstrate that human cognitive categories themselves are limiting rather than neutral tools for understanding. Consider the function of untranslatable passages. Stories reference sections of the Necronomicon written in languages that resist translation not through obscurity, but through structural incompatibility. The issue isn't missing vocabulary, it's that the concepts being expressed don't map onto human linguistic categories. This suggests something more disturbing than mere communication barrier. It suggests that some forms of knowledge might be species-specific, that what counts as coherent thought for one type of consciousness might be literally incoherent for another. The untranslatable passages don't conceal information. They demonstrate limits of human cognition itself. The relationship between knowledge and power inverts traditional occult dynamics. Grimoires typically promise that hidden knowledge grants control, speak the right words, perform the correct ritual, and compel desired outcome. The Necronomicon offers no such empowerment. Its revelations demonstrate powerlessness. Learning that old ones exist doesn't provide means to influence them. Understanding cosmic chronology clarifies that human civilization occupies insignificant temporal sliver. Discovering that reality contains dimensions beyond human perception emphasizes perceptual limitation rather than expanding access. Each piece of knowledge reinforces human irrelevance rather than enabling transcendence. This produces what we might call cognitive contamination. Once certain concepts enter consciousness, they cannot be removed. A character who learns that Cthulhu lies dreaming in Arlia cannot subsequently believe that humanity represents cosmic pinnacle. Someone who understands that Azathoth churns at the center of chaos cannot maintain faith in cosmic purpose or divine plan. The knowledge operates like virus. It replicates through implications, each revelation triggering further recognition that compounds the initial damage. The contamination spreads not through magical curse, but through logical entailment. Lovecraft explores this through scholarly communities in his fiction. Characters often discover that small networks of researchers have independently encountered similar information and reached similar conclusions. These communities don't offer comfort. They provide confirmation that the disturbing revelations aren't individual delusion. This social dimension of forbidden knowledge proves particularly insidious. It removes the comforting possibility that one's interpretation might be mistaken. When multiple independent researchers using different methodologies reach the same horrifying conclusions, the conclusions become harder to dismiss as error or madness. The Necronomicon also documents what we might call cascading revelation. Early sections describe entities and places that seem fantastic but theoretically possible. Ancient civilizations, unknown species, archaeological mysteries. Deeper sections reveal that these surface anomalies point toward more fundamental problems with consensus reality. The Antarctic City in At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, initially appears as archaeological marvel, but the Necronomicon referenced context reveals it as evidence that life on Earth was seeded by alien entities for purposes having nothing to do with human flourishing. Each layer of knowledge recontextualizes previous understanding in progressively more disturbing frameworks. This produces epistemic vertigo, the disorienting recognition that every framework for understanding reality might be provisional, limited, and ultimately inadequate. Scientific materialism explains terrestrial phenomena but cannot account for non-Euclidean geometries. Religious frameworks provide meaning but fail when confronted with entities genuinely beyond good and evil. Philosophical systems offer coherence but presume human consciousness as valid reference point. The Necronomicon systematically undermines each framework by presenting information that doesn't fit within any of them. The book's function thus involves demonstrating what philosophers call the theory-ladenness of observation, the principle that what we see depends on conceptual frameworks we bring to seeing. But it takes this further. It suggests that some realities might be genuinely imperceptible within human conceptual frameworks, that major features of existence might remain permanently beyond human epistemological capacity. This isn't mysticism claiming truth exceeds reason. It's naturalistic argument that cognitive evolution produces adaptive but limited awareness. The horror involves recognizing these limits while remaining unable to transcend them. Perhaps most disturbing, the Necronomicon implies that ignorance represents not absence of knowledge, but actively maintained state. Human sanity depends on not noticing certain features of reality, on filtering, ignoring, and misinterpreting information that would otherwise produce cognitive collapse. The book removes these filters. It forces attention toward what consciousness normally excludes for self-protection. In this framework, madness isn't deviation from reality, but dangerous proximity to it. The forbidden knowledge isn't false. It's true in ways that human consciousness cannot safely accommodate. The Necronomicon's first published appearance occurs in The Hound, 1924, though the story treats it as established reference rather than introducing it. The narrator and his companion, grave-robbing aesthetes seeking transgressive thrills, steal an amulet from a Dutch tomb. Their research leads them to a crumbling, worm-eaten tome that identifies the amulet's connection to a cult and its peculiar baying hound guardian. Lovecraft provides no elaborate description of the book itself. It simply exists as scholarly resource within the story's world, its authority assumed rather than established. This casual introduction proves strategically effective. By presenting the Necronomicon as already known text, rather than sensational discovery, Lovecraft grants it immediate credibility within the narrative frame. Characters don't marvel at finding forbidden grimoire. They consult it the way scholars consult any reference work. This normalizes the book's existence, while simultaneously suggesting its contents are anything but normal. The technique resembles how historical fiction references real texts. The assumption of familiarity creates verisimilitude. The Festival, 1925, provides more detail about the book's physical form and contents. The narrator, drawn to an ancestral home in Kingsport for a winter celebration, discovers his family maintains disturbing traditions documented in ancient texts. Here, Lovecraft describes the Necronomicon specifically. I shivered involuntarily as I saw the title. The repellent Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. The story establishes the book's reputation. It's repellent, its author is mad, yet it contains verifiable information about hidden rites and subterranean horrors. The narrative confirms the book's claims through events that unfold, lending its contents retrospective authority. The intertextual network expands significantly in The Call of Cthulhu, 1928. Here, the Necronomicon appears alongside other forbidden texts, the Pennacotic manuscripts, the Book of Eibon, Conte d'Erlet's Culte des Goules. This bibliographic multiplication creates what literary scholars call a citation network, multiple sources apparently corroborating each other's claims. The story quotes the Necronomicon directly. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. This couplet becomes the mythology's most famous distillation, suggesting that conventional categories like life and death inadequately describe cosmic entities. Lovecraft's technique involves building the book's authority through narrative structure rather than exposition. Characters encounter mysteries, research possible explanations, consult the Necronomicon, and discover that its descriptions match phenomena they're experiencing. This creates feedback loop. The story validates the book explains the story, and both seem to reference realities beyond either. The reader encounters the text through characters who treat it as genuine historical artifact, and narrative events consistently confirm its reliability as information source. The cross-references between stories create deeper mythology. The Dunwich Horror, 1929, reveals that Miskatonic University's library contains one of the few surviving copies, locked away in a restricted collection. Dr. Armitage must petition for access, establishing institutional recognition of the book's dangerous nature. When he finally reads relevant passages, they explain the physiological impossibilities the story has been documenting, how Wilbur Whately could be simultaneously human and something else entirely. The Necronomicon functions as explanation key that makes narrative impossibilities coherent within the story's logic. By At the Mountains of Madness, Qui Quien Agitron, 1936, the Necronomicon serves as historical record, corroborating archaeological evidence. The expedition discovers an ancient Antarctic city, whose architecture and inhabitant remains seem impossible. References to the Necronomicon provide framework for understanding. The Old Ones created life on Earth as experiment or accident, and the city represents their abandoned laboratory. The book transforms what appears to be scientific mystery into cosmic horror. It recontextualizes evidence by providing unwelcome context that explains too much. The intertextual connections extend beyond Lovecraft's own work. He actively encouraged Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, and others to reference the Necronomicon in their fiction. When multiple authors across different stories and settings mention the same text, it achieves literary persistence beyond any single narrative. The book becomes part of shared vocabulary, a reference point that exists independent of particular stories. This collaborative world-building transforms private invention into something resembling folklore, a collectively maintained fiction that transcends individual authorship. The evolution shows calculated restraint. Early stories mention the Necronomicon briefly. Later works provide more detail, but never complete it. Lovecraft understood that the book's power depended on remaining suggestive rather than definitive. Each appearance adds fragments, a passage here, a historical detail there, but the whole remains inaccessible. This cumulative technique mirrors how real historical texts become known, through citations, excerpts, and scholarly commentary rather than total availability. The Necronomicon achieves literary reality through the same mechanisms that establish any text's cultural presence: reference, reputation, and systematic integration into knowledge networks. The Dunwich Horror, 1929, presents the Necronomicon functioning at maximum narrative capacity, simultaneously as plot, device, scholarly authority, and thematic embodiment of forbidden knowledge's consequences. The story takes place in rural Massachusetts, where the Whately family has maintained suspicious isolation for generations. Wilbur Whately, born under mysterious circumstances in 1913, grows to monstrous proportions with unnatural speed, while his grandfather, Old Whately, mutters about cosmic timetables and planetary alignments. The Necronomicon enters the narrative through Wilbur's desperate quest for knowledge. Despite his rural upbringing and minimal formal education, he demonstrates sophisticated understanding of esoteric texts. He travels to Miskatonic University specifically to access their copy of the Latin Necronomicon, one of the few complete editions allegedly surviving. His request to Dr. Armitage, the head librarian, reveals both his obsession and his partial knowledge. He already owns the English translation by John Dee, itself fictional, but needs access to the complete Latin text for passages omitted or obscured in translation. Dr. Armitage refuses the request, disturbed by something indefinable in Wilbur's appearance and demeanor. This refusal proves fateful. Wilbur attempts to break into the library at night to steal the text, triggering a guard dog that attacks him. His death reveals his true nature. He's only partially human, with anatomy suggesting hybridization with something utterly alien. The discovery forces Armitage to confront evidence that contradicts every biological principle he knows. The story's crucial turn involves Armitage's decision to examine Wilbur's personal papers and consult the Necronomicon himself to understand what he's discovered. Lovecraft provides unusual detail here about the reading process. Armitage began to collate with feverish haste the scattered notes he had found in the secret places of Wilbur Whately's study. The professor reads through the night, cross-referencing Wilbur's diary against the Necronomicon's, accounts of entity summoning, dimensional gates, and hybrid breeding programs. This research montage emphasizes that understanding requires engaging with the very text whose danger the story has been establishing. What Armitage learns transforms local mystery into cosmic threat. The Whately family has been attempting to summon Yog-Sothoth, described in the Necronomicon as entity coextensive with all space and time. Old Whately conducted ritual that resulted in twin offspring, Wilbur and his invisible brother, both hybrid entities serving as potential conduits for their extra-dimensional father's return. The brother, kept hidden in the family farmhouse, has grown to immense proportions. Wilbur's quest for the complete Necronomicon involved finding specific rituals to open dimensional gateways, allowing his brother to summon forces that would clear off the earth and make room for the Old One's return. The climax involves Armitage and two colleagues, Professors Rice and Morgan, using the Necronomicon against its apparent purpose. They locate the invisible entity ravaging the countryside and employ counter-rituals from the text to banish it. Lovecraft provides fragments of the ritual, a prolonged roll call of blasphemous names and formulas in languages, some of which were surely the last earthly dialect of a dying world. The scene inverts typical horror resolution. The protagonists don't destroy the monster through conventional means, but through engaging with the same forbidden knowledge that created the threat. The story's treatment of the Necronomicon reveals several key functions. First, it serves as genealogical record, documenting breeding programs between humans and cosmic entities that stretch back centuries. Second, it provides cosmological framework explaining why such hybridization matters. the old ones seek to reclaim Earth from human occupancy. Third, it contains both summoning and banishing rituals, suggesting the book's knowledge cuts both ways. The text enables threats, but also provides means to address them, though at cost of understanding things human consciousness wasn't designed to comprehend. Armitage's transformation proves significant. He begins as rational academic, devoted to preserving rare texts, but skeptical of their supernatural claims. His encounter with Wilbur's body and subsequent research in the Necronomicon forces recognition that the text documents reality rather than fantasy. This doesn't make him believer in traditional sense. He doesn't embrace the old ones or seek further revelation. Instead, he becomes burden-bearer of terrible knowledge, choosing to contain rather than disseminate what he's learned. His final act involves concealing the true nature of the crisis from the public, maintaining comfortable ignorance for those who didn't have to face evidence directly. The story also examines class and knowledge access. Wilbur Whately, despite rural poverty and social marginalization, demonstrates that dangerous knowledge doesn't respect social boundaries. He taught himself languages, tracked down rare texts, and understood cosmic principles that most scholars never encounter. His lack of formal credentials doesn't prevent him from comprehending and attempting to apply the Necronomicon's contents. This democratization of forbidden knowledge suggests that the threat isn't limited to elite circles. Anyone with sufficient obsession and minimal resources can access information capable of producing catastrophic consequences. The Dunwich Horror ultimately presents the Necronomicon as fundamentally ambivalent tool. It enables the threat through Whately family's multi-generational project, but also provides means to counter that threat. The book doesn't choose sides because it predates the conflict. It simply documents realities that exist regardless of human preference. This neutrality makes it more disturbing than straightforwardly evil artifact would be. The text operates as window into cosmic mechanisms that continue functioning whether humans observe them or not, and observation itself constitutes the primary danger. The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1936, engages with the Necronomicon differently than other major stories. Here, the book functions less as plot device and more as historical context that characters piece together retrospectively. The narrator, a young man researching New England antiquities, arrives in the decaying coastal town of Innsmouth and gradually discovers its inhabitants maintain disturbing connections to submarine entities called Deep Ones. The horror unfolds through accumulated detail. The town's peculiar architecture, its residents' distinctive physical features, and the pervasive atmosphere of wrongness that defies immediate explanation. The Necronomicon appears not in the story itself, but in the interpretive framework surrounding it. Lovecraft establishes that the town's degeneracy stems from a pact made in the 1840s, when Captain Obed Marsh encountered Deep One colonies in Polynesia. The entities offered abundant fishing catches and gold artifacts in exchange for interbreeding with humans and worship through the esoteric order of Dagon. This arrangement produced hybrid offspring, displaying progressively more aquatic characteristics, what locals euphemistically call the Innsmouth look. Where does the Necronomicon fit this narrative? In Lovecraft's broader mythology, the text supposedly documents the Deep One's history, their connection to Cthulhu, and the biological mechanisms allowing cross-species breeding. The book provides scholarly context for what would otherwise seem biologically impossible. It explains that Deep Ones are not mutations or diseases, but distinct species with life cycle that includes terrestrial phase. Their ability to interbreed with humans isn't miraculous. It's documented xenobiology with precedents stretching back to prehistory. The story's narrator doesn't encounter the Necronomicon directly during his Innsmouth investigation, but his subsequent research after escaping the town involves consulting texts that reference it. Lovecraft structures this as detective work. The narrator seeks explanation for experiences that conventional frameworks cannot accommodate. He learns about similar coastal cults, finds anthropological accounts of South Pacific rituals matching those practiced in Innsmouth, and discovers that respected scholars have documented phenomena consistent with his observations. The Necronomicon exists as synthesizing text that transforms scattered evidence into coherent, if horrifying, pattern. The genealogical dimension proves central. As the narrator researches his own family history, he discovers his grandmother came from Innsmouth and disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The Necronomicon's documentation of hybrid bloodlines suddenly becomes personally relevant. He realizes he carries Deep One genetics and will eventually undergo transformation into fully aquatic form. This biological horror, the recognition that one's own body contains inhuman potential, represents the story's philosophical core. Identity proves less stable than consciousness assumes. Human nature isn't fixed essence, but temporary configuration subject to revision. Lovecraft uses the Necronomicon here to establish historical depth. The Deep One pacts didn't begin with Captain Marsh in the 1840s. They extend back through multiple civilizations. The book supposedly references similar arrangements in ancient Phoenicia, medieval Cornwall, and prehistoric Pacific islands. This suggests that human Deep One interaction represents recurring phenomenon rather than isolated aberration. The pattern repeats across cultures and epochs, implying that something in human coastal settlement makes these encounters probable rather than exceptional. The story's treatment of immortality deserves attention. Deep Ones don't age in conventional sense. They exist for centuries at ocean depths, emerging periodically to interact with surface dwellers. The Necronomicon allegedly describes this as biological rather than supernatural phenomenon. Their cellular structure simply doesn't undergo senescence the way terrestrial life does. For hybrid offspring like the narrator, this means inherited potential for indefinite lifespan, though at cost of abandoning human identity entirely. The promise isn't eternal life as human, but eternal existence as something other. This creates inversion of traditional vampire or werewolf narrative. Those horror archetypes involve external curse or infection, transforming victims against their nature. The Shadow over Innsmouth presents transformation as actualization of existing nature. The narrator doesn't become something foreign to himself, but discovers what he always inherently was. The horror involves recognition rather than invasion. The Necronomicon's function involves documenting this biological reality, providing context that makes the impossible comprehensible even as comprehension brings no comfort. The cultural dimension matters as well. Innsmouth's isolation stems from knowledge that surrounding communities cannot accept. The town maintains its degraded independence because acknowledging its true nature would force uncomfortable questions about human boundaries and biological essentialism. The Necronomicon documents evidence that species distinctions are more porous than taxonomy assumes, that human evolution might be less autonomous than naturalistic accounts suggest, and that intelligence and consciousness exist in forms profoundly alien to terrestrial norms. These implications threaten foundations of anthropology, biology, and philosophy simultaneously. Lovecraft structures the revelation carefully. The narrator's dreams begin featuring memories that aren't his, visions of submarine cities, non-Euclidean architecture, and vast temporal scales. These aren't psychological fantasies but genetic memories inherited from Deep One ancestry. The Necronomicon supposedly explains this mechanism. Hybrid genetics carry encoded information that surfaces as consciousness shifts toward aquatic phase. Memory itself proves less individual than biology suggests. Identity bleeds across generations through mechanisms that precede psychology. The story concludes with the narrator accepting his transformation. He will join his relatives in deep ocean trenches, abandoning human society for existence among entities whose relationship to humanity is best described as indifferent coexistence. The Necronomicon's role throughout involves providing intellectual framework that makes this choice seem inevitable rather than insane. The book doesn't advocate for transformation. It simply documents its biological and historical reality with sufficient detail that resistance appears futile. The Shadow over Innsmouth thus presents the Necronomicon as genealogical and biological authority rather than purely mystical text. It traces bloodlines, explains inheritance mechanisms, and documents cross-species interactions with clinical precision. This scientific framing makes the horror more insidious. These aren't supernatural curses, but natural processes that challenge human self-understanding. The book reveals that biology itself contains cosmic horror, that physical form is less stable than consciousness assumes, and that heredity transmits potentials we neither choose nor fully comprehend until they manifest. Lovecraft's death in 1937 transformed the Necronomicon from controlled invention into contested territory. August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and co-founder of Arkham House Publishing, assumed stewardship of the mythology and promptly began reshaping it according to his own theological inclinations. Where Lovecraft maintained cosmic indifference as philosophical core, Derleth imposed dualistic struggle between good and evil forces. This revision fundamentally altered the Necronomicon's function from neutral documentation to artifact in cosmic warfare. Derleth's stories present the book as containing knowledge of elder gods who oppose the old ones and protect humanity. This invention directly contradicts Lovecraft's philosophy. It reintroduces moral framework and human significance that cosmicism deliberately rejected. In Derleth's The Trail of Cthulhu, 1944, and related stories, characters use the Necronomicon to identify protective deities and summon their intervention. The text becomes grimoire in traditional sense, a manual for compelling supernatural forces toward human ends. This represents theological recuperation of cosmic horror, domesticating its radical implications into familiar good versus evil narrative. The shift reveals deeper tension in collaborative mythology. Lovecraft encouraged others to use his inventions, but couldn't control how they'd be interpreted after his death. Derleth held legal authority over the material and used it to publish revised or completed versions of Lovecraft's fragmentary drafts, often adding his own theological framework. The Necronomicon thus accumulated contradictory characterizations. Lovecraft's amoral cosmic documentation versus Derleth's morally charged occult manual. Readers encountering the mythology had to navigate these incompatible visions, often without clear indication of which author contributed which elements. Other writers took different approaches. Robert Bloch, Lovecraft's correspondent and friend, maintained darker tone in stories like The Shambler from the Stars, 1935, and its sequel, The Shadow from the Steeple, 1950. Bloch's Necronomicon remains dangerous precisely because it documents realities indifferent to human welfare. His characters who consult the text typically suffer consequences, not as moral punishment, but as inevitable result of engaging with information human consciousness cannot safely process. This preserves Lovecraft's original conception while exploring different narrative possibilities. The most significant expansion came from writers outside Lovecraft's immediate circle. Ramsey Campbell, in stories from the 1960s onward, relocated cosmic horror to English settings and developed his own forbidden texts while maintaining references to the Necronomicon as foundational document. His approach treats the book as historical artifact that influenced other occult traditions, creating genealogy of forbidden knowledge where texts reference and corrupt each other across centuries. This multiplication of sources prevents any single text from becoming definitive, maintaining the interpretive ambiguity Lovecraft valued. Brian Lumley's Titus Crow series, beginning 1971, took even more dramatic liberties, transforming cosmic horror into science fiction, where old ones represent extra-dimensional aliens susceptible to sufficiently advanced technology. Lumley's Necronomicon becomes technical, manual rather than mystical text. It contains dimensional mathematics, biological specifications, and engineering principles. This rationalization appealed to readers uncomfortable with supernatural elements, but diminished the epistemological horror that made the book philosophically interesting. When cosmic mysteries become solvable through applied science, they lose their capacity to induce the cognitive vertigo Lovecraft intended. The role-playing game Call of Cthulhu, 1981, codified the mythology for millions of players who never read the original stories. The game required practical information. What does the Necronomicon actually contain? What spells can players learn from it? What game mechanical effects does reading produce? Designer Sandy Peterson made necessary compromises, providing specific details that Lovecraft deliberately withheld. Players could consult charts listing the book's contents, roll dice to determine sanity loss from reading, and learn defined rituals with predictable outcomes. This systematization transformed suggestive horror into manageable game mechanics. The game's influence proved immense. Entire generation of horror fans encountered Lovecraft through role-playing before reading original stories. They arrived expecting detailed monster stat blocks, comprehensive spell lists, and clear cause-effect relationships. Exactly what Lovecraft avoided. The Necronomicon became player resource rather than existential threat, its contents cataloged in rulebooks that cheerfully contradicted the principle that some knowledge destroys the knower. The commercial success of this approach influenced subsequent fiction, creating feedback loop where later writers incorporated game-derived elements into stories, further diluting the original philosophical project. Academic attention added another layer. S.T. Joshi's definitive scholarship on Lovecraft, particularly H.P. Lovecraft, A Life, 1996, established canonical texts and identified later interpolations. Joshi argued forcefully against Derleth's theological revisions, advocating return to Lovecraft's original cosmicism. This created split between popular understanding, influenced by Derleth, games, and commercial adaptations, and scholarly consensus, emphasizing Lovecraft's actual texts and philosophy. The Necronomicon thus exists in multiple versions simultaneously. Lovecraft's fragmentary suggestion, Derleth's moralized expansion, game designers' practical specifications, and scholars' careful reconstruction. The strangest expansion involved actual publication of the Necronomicon itself. Multiple authors have written complete texts claiming to be the grimoire Lovecraft invented. The most notorious, published by Schlangekraft in 1977 and attributed to Simon, combines Sumerian mythology with Lovecraft's framework to create coherent occult manual. This hoax made real proves bizarrely successful. It remains in print decades later, purchased by readers who either don't realize its modern invention or don't care. The book Lovecraft created as fiction has been made literally real through publication, though its contents bear only superficial relationship to what his stories suggest. These expansions reveal tensions inherent in collaborative mythology. Each edition enriches the material culture around the Necronomicon while potentially diluting its philosophical impact. The book has achieved cultural presence Lovecraft never anticipated, but at cost of coherence. It simultaneously represents cosmic indifference, theological battleground, game mechanic, scholarly artifact, and published grimoire available through online retailers. This multiplication of meanings mirrors the book's original function, to exist ambiguously between categories. But whether this enriches or diminishes the concept remains contested among readers and scholars who continue arguing about what the Necronomicon truly is, despite knowing it never was. The boundary between fiction and belief collapsed remarkably quickly after Lovecraft's death. By the 1960s, genuine occultists were attempting to locate copies of the Necronomicon, convinced that Lovecraft had stumbled upon or deliberately concealed real esoteric knowledge. This transformation from acknowledged fiction to sought artifact reveals something fundamental about how cultural myths propagate in modern contexts where irony and sincerity constantly intermingle. The first significant library hoax occurred at the University of California, San Diego, in the 1970s. Someone created elaborate catalog cards for the Necronomicon and filed them in the library's card catalog system. The cards provided detailed bibliographic information, publication history, physical description, even a call number directing seekers to a location in the stacks. When students and researchers requested the book, librarians discovered the hoax, but the cards kept reappearing after removal. This guerrilla myth-making transformed the library into active site where fiction attempted to achieve material reality through bureaucratic infrastructure. Similar incidents occurred at Yale, the University of Tromsø in Norway, and the New York Public Library. Each hoax followed comparable pattern: create official-looking documentation, insert it into legitimate cataloging systems, and wait for the confusion. These weren't pranks targeting specific individuals. They were interventions in knowledge infrastructure designed to blur the line between real and fictional texts. The hoaxes succeeded because library catalogs represent trust systems. We assume entries correspond to physical objects. By exploiting this trust, the hoaxes made the Necronomicon briefly real in administrative sense, if not physical one. The internet accelerated this mythology multiplication. Websites appeared claiming to document Necronomicon sightings, historical references, and translation projects. Some maintained explicit fiction, but others adopted ambiguous tone that left readers uncertain whether claims were serious. This calculated ambiguity proved effective. It allowed believers to find validation while permitting skeptics to enjoy elaborate performance. The question, "Is this real?" became less relevant than the community that formed around debating it. Occult communities developed complex positions on the book's status. Some argued that Lovecraft channeled genuine information despite thinking he was writing fiction, that cosmic entities manipulated him into revealing actual secrets. This theory granted Lovecraft prophetic status while maintaining that he misunderstood his own work. Others suggested that the Necronomicon existed independently and Lovecraft merely rediscovered it through dreams or research. A third faction claimed that widespread belief in the book had effectively created it through collective thought, that sufficient imaginative investment could manifest fictional objects into magical reality. The most unsettling dimension involves criminal citations. Multiple murder cases from the 1980s and 1990s featured defendants claiming inspiration from or possession of the Necronomicon. These cases prompted awkward questions. Does fictional text bear responsibility when readers act on its contents? The question assumes clear distinction between fiction and reality that these cases deliberately violated. Defendants weren't confused about the book's fictional origins. They chose to treat it as real, despite knowing otherwise. This willful blurring represents something more complex than simple delusion. Urban legends accumulated around specific copies. Stories circulated about translated manuscripts in private collections, medieval Arabic originals discovered in Damascus or Cairo, and Latin editions hidden in Vatican archives. Each legend followed formula. The book exists, authorities know about it, and access is restricted for public safety. This narrative structure mirrors conspiracy theories about suppressed technology or hidden history. The appeal lies not in actually reading the text, but in believing knowledge exists beyond official acknowledgement, that reality contains layers not accessible through conventional channels. Contemporary occult publishers capitalized on this ambiguity by producing actual Necronomicons. The Simon Necronomicon, 1977, proved most commercially successful, combining Sumerian mythology with Lovecraft references to create coherent grimoire, complete with rituals, sigils, and invocations. The book's introduction claims complicated provenance involving mysterious monks and ancient manuscripts, a framing that maintains ambiguity about whether content is recovered or invented. It remains in print nearly 5 decades later, purchased by readers across the belief spectrum from committed practitioners to ironic collectors. The hoaxes and sightings reveal desire for the numinous in culture increasingly dominated by verifiable information. The Necronomicon offers mystery that resists resolution. Every debunking creates space for new claims. Every hoax exposed makes the real book seem more plausibly hidden. This perpetual deferral, the book always exists elsewhere, in another archive, another translation, maintains productive uncertainty. It allows the Necronomicon to function as what anthropologists call a mobile myth, a narrative that adapts to local contexts while maintaining core structure. The book will always be found next year, in the next archive, after the next translation project. Its non-existence thus guarantees its cultural immortality. The Necronomicon's transition into visual and interactive media required solving fundamental problem: how to represent a text whose power depends on remaining unrepresented. Film adaptations beginning in the 1960s took various approaches, most sacrificing the book's philosophical depth for practical plot function. Roger Corman's loose Lovecraft adaptations rarely featured the Necronomicon directly, recognizing perhaps that showing the book diminishes its suggestive power. When the text does appear, it typically serves as MacGuffin, object characters seek or protect without engaging with its actual contents. Sam Raimi's Evil Dead trilogy, 1981-1992, demonstrates both possibilities and limitations of cinematic adaptation. Raimi renames the book Necronomicon Ex Mortis and reimagines it as bound in human flesh tome containing demon-summoning incantations. The films treat it as straightforward horror prop. Reading passages aloud unleashes supernatural violence. This simplification eliminates cosmic horror's epistemological dimension. The book causes direct physical effects rather than cognitive dissolution. Yet Raimi's approach proved influential precisely through this simplification. The Evil Dead Necronomicon established visual template. Ancient, leather-bound, adorned with disturbing imagery, radiating obvious malevolence. The gaming industry integrated the Necronomicon more thoroughly into interactive narratives. Call of Cthulhu, 1981, made its central game mechanic. Reading the book provides crucial knowledge but costs sanity points. This created tension between player objectives, gather information, solve mysteries, and character survival, maintain mental stability. The game's success demonstrated that Lovecraft's themes could translate to participatory media if mechanics reinforced philosophical content. Players experienced firsthand the trap of forbidden knowledge, needing to read dangerous texts to progress while knowing each reading damages their character. Video games extended this approach across multiple platforms. Alone in the Dark, 1992, featured the Necronomicon as puzzle element. Players must find and decipher passages to progress through Haunted Mansion. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002, built entire gameplay system around sanity mechanics inspired by Lovecraft, with the Necronomicon appearing as historical artifact connecting different time periods. These games succeeded when they made the book's danger ludic reality. Reading it provided necessary information, but triggered consequences affecting player experience. Screen distortions, audio hallucinations, and fake system crashes simulated cognitive breakdown within gaming medium. Heavy metal and experimental music found different uses for Necronomicon imagery. Bands like Morbid Angel, Nile, and the Darkest of the Hillside Thickets incorporated Lovecraftian references into lyrics and album concepts. Morbid Angel's guitarist Trey Azagthoth adopted stage name from Lovecraft's mythology and structured albums around cosmic horror themes. The music itself attempts sonic translation of the book's effect. Dissonant tonalities, unconventional time signatures, and overwhelming volume, creating auditory experience of order dissolving into chaos. Whether this constitutes genuine artistic engagement with Lovecraft's philosophy or merely appropriates his aesthetic remains debated. The most philosophically interesting musical engagement comes from experimental and dark ambient genres. Artists like Cryo Chamber and Atrium Carceri create soundscapes explicitly inspired by Lovecraft's cosmic horror, attempting to evoke the affective experience of encountering the unknowable. These compositions often feature sub-bass frequencies at the edge of human hearing, disorienting spatial effects, and field recordings processed beyond recognition. The music doesn't represent the Necronomicon narratively. It attempts to create auditory equivalent of reading it, producing unease through sound design rather than lyrical content. Graphic novels and comics approach the challenge through visual metaphor. Alan Moore's Providence, 2015-2017, features the Necronomicon as text that exists simultaneously across multiple levels, as physical book, as shared delusion, as linguistic virus propagating through culture. Moore's treatment preserves ambiguity about the book's ontological status, while exploring how ideas achieve power through repetition and belief. The comic medium allows Moore to show fragments of text without fully representing it, maintaining suggestion over specification. Tabletop role-playing beyond Call of Cthulhu found various uses for the mythology. Delta Green, 1997, reimagines Lovecraftian horror as government conspiracy, with the Necronomicon representing intelligence asset. Dangerous but potentially useful information that agencies attempt to control and weaponize. This translation into contemporary paranoid thriller idiom updates cosmic horror for post-Cold War anxieties about information control and institutional knowledge. The book becomes classified document rather than ancient grimoire, but its function remains similar. It contains truths that damage those who learn them. Digital media enabled new forms of engagement. The SCP Foundation Collaborative Writing Project created similar mythology around anomalous objects and entities requiring containment. While not directly featuring the Necronomicon, the project clearly inherits its logic. Dangerous knowledge must be documented and controlled, but never fully disseminated. The Foundation's clinical tone and bureaucratic procedures provide modern framework for cosmic horror, translating Lovecraft's antiquarian style into contemporary institutional language. The persistence across media suggests the Necronomicon addresses anxieties that transcend specific historical moments or artistic media. Each adaptation translates core concepts into its medium's language. Film uses visual design and atmosphere. Games employ mechanical consequences. Music creates affective experience. Comics blend text and image. The most successful adaptations recognize that the book itself matters less than what it represents. The idea that knowledge can be genuinely dangerous, that understanding might cost more than ignorance, and that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. These remain potent concerns regardless of whether we encounter them through pulp fiction, video game mechanics, or experimental soundscapes. The Necronomicon achieved unusual distinction by becoming simultaneously object of academic study and subcultural fetish. This dual existence, analyzed in university seminars while circulating through occult bookshops, reveals how fictional texts can occupy multiple cultural registers at once, each context producing different interpretations of the same invented artifact. Academic engagement began seriously in the 1970s with scholars like Dirk Mosig and S.T. Joshi establishing Lovecraft studies as legitimate field. Their work positioned the Necronomicon as literary device worthy of serious analysis rather than mere genre prop. Joshi's scholarship particularly emphasized how the book functioned within Lovecraft's philosophical materialism. It represented his attempt to imagine what forbidden knowledge would look like in universe without supernatural intervention. This academic framing treated the text as thought experiment about epistemology rather than actual grimoire, distinguishing scholarly interpretation from occult appropriation. Philosophy departments found unexpected use for Lovecraft's concepts. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, employed cosmic horror to explore what he calls the world without us, the philosophical problem of conceptualizing reality independent of human thought. The Necronomicon serves as perfect symbol for this problem. It supposedly documents realities that precede and exceed human cognitive categories. Thacker's work demonstrates how Lovecraft's fiction addresses genuine philosophical questions about the limits of human knowledge and the relationship between thought and reality. Gothic and horror studies incorporated the Necronomicon into discussions of textual transmission and bibliographic uncanny. Critics examined how fictional books function differently than fictional characters or places. Texts carry special ontological weight because they exist as information rather than physical entities. The Necronomicon demonstrates this principle. You cannot visit Arlier or meet Cthulhu, but you could theoretically read the forbidden text. This nearness, the sense that the book exists just beyond accessibility, generates distinct form of horror unavailable through other fictional elements. Simultaneously, occult subcultures claimed the Necronomicon for practices Lovecraft would have found absurd. Chaos magic practitioners in the 1980s argued that fictional belief systems work as effectively as traditional ones, that gods and grimoires become real through sustained imaginative investment. From this perspective, the Necronomicon's fictional origins prove irrelevant. What matters is the accumulated psychic energy directed toward it across decades. This approach treats belief itself as creative act. We conjure the text into existence through collective attention. The Church of the Subgenius and similar postmodern religious movements incorporated Lovecraftian elements into deliberately absurdist theologies. These groups recognize the Necronomicon as perfect symbol for their project, a text that simultaneously mocks and embodies spiritual seeking. The book's non-existence becomes theological statement. All religious texts are human inventions, so why not embrace obviously fictional ones? This ironic appropriation performs critique of religious authority while maintaining space for genuine spiritual experience, however paradoxical that combination might seem. Gothic and industrial music subcultures adopted Lovecraftian aesthetics extensively. The Necronomicon appeared on album covers, in song lyrics, and as inspiration for visual design emphasizing decay, forbidden knowledge, and cosmic indifference. Bands like Throbbing Gristle and Coil explored how occult symbolism functions in post-religious contexts, not as literal belief, but as aesthetic and philosophical framework for exploring transgression, knowledge, and the limits of human understanding. The book provided ready-made iconography for these explorations. Academic conferences on Lovecraft became regular occurrences, with the Necronomicon featuring prominently in discussions of world-building, collaborative fiction, and transmedia storytelling. Scholars analyzed how the text functions across different narratives, how collaborative authors maintained or violated its established parameters, and what its persistence reveals about reader desire for comprehensive fictional universes. These analyses treated the book as case study in literary mythology construction. How do invented elements achieve cultural persistence beyond their original contexts? Meanwhile, conspiracy theory communities developed elaborate narratives positioning the Necronomicon within frameworks of suppressed knowledge. These theories claimed governments or secret societies possessed genuine copies, but concealed them to prevent public access to dangerous information. The logic mirrors other conspiracy narratives about hidden technology or suppressed history. Authorities know truths they refuse to share. The Necronomicon fit perfectly into this narrative structure, providing concrete object around which conspiracy theories could crystallize. Literature departments incorporated Lovecraft into post-colonial and critical race studies, analyzing his xenophobia and how it shaped his cosmic horror. The Necronomicon gained new significance in these readings as product of author, whose philosophy combined materialist atheism with racist anxiety about cultural contamination. The book's Mad Arab author and its transmission through non-Western cultures revealed Lovecraft's racial anxieties, while inadvertently creating space for critics to analyze how horror literature processes cultural difference. Academic appropriation here involved reading against the text. Using it to understand ideologies its creator might not have consciously intended to express. Digital humanities scholars examined the Necronomicon as early example of collaborative world-building that anticipated contemporary fan practices. The Cthulhu Mythos Wikia and similar resources document every reference, creating comprehensive databases that treat the mythology with archival seriousness. This represents a form of participatory scholarship, where fans produce knowledge, infrastructure rivaling academic resources. The distinction between academic and fan expertise blurs when both produce detailed textual analysis, though their purposes differ. Scholars analyze for understanding, while fans expand for creative engagement. The subcultural academic split reveals broader tension about how fictional texts circulate in contemporary culture. Academics approach the Necronomicon as Lovecraft's invention worthy of analysis within his historical and philosophical context. Subcultures treat it as living mythology available for creative reinterpretation, regardless of original intent. Neither approach is wrong, but they produce incompatible understandings of what the text is and how it should be engaged. This productive tension ensures the Necronomicon remains contested territory. Simultaneously, historical artifact and evolving mythology, closed text, and open-source fiction, object of study and tool for creative practice. The Necronomicon persists because it addresses anxieties that remain structurally constant despite changing historical contexts. At core, it represents the vertigo produced when consciousness confronts evidence of its own contingency. The recognition that human thought might be local phenomenon without cosmic significance. This anxiety doesn't belong exclusively to any era. It recurs whenever people seriously contemplate their position within reality indifferent to their existence. The book's fictional status paradoxically enhances its psychological power. An actual ancient grimoire could be dismissed as historical curiosity or debunked through scholarly examination. The Necronomicon, precisely because it never existed, cannot be definitively evaluated. It occupies permanent position just beyond verification, close enough to seem plausible, distant enough to resist final judgment. This structural ambiguity mirrors the epistemological condition it represents. We cannot definitively know whether our frameworks for understanding reality adequately capture that reality, or merely project human categories onto something fundamentally alien to those categories. Contemporary technological anxiety finds unexpected resonance in Lovecraft's century-old invention. The exponential growth of information, data accumulating faster than human capacity to process it, creates conditions analogous to reading the Necronomicon. We confront knowledge that exceeds our cognitive architecture's ability to integrate it into coherent worldview. Machine learning algorithms produce results their creators cannot fully explain. Scientific specialization means no individual can comprehend more than tiny fraction of human knowledge. The book thus becomes metaphor for information overload in era where knowing too much produces paralysis rather than empowerment. The environmental crisis adds additional layer of significance. Climate change and ecological collapse demonstrate that human civilization exists within systems it neither controls nor fully understands. The Old One's temporal priority and inevitable return mirrors our growing recognition that Earth's biosphere predates humanity by eons and might continue long after our extinction. The Necronomicon's cosmicism, its insistence that human concerns don't determine cosmic outcomes, resonates painfully in moment when collective action proves insufficient against planetary-scale processes indifferent to our survival preferences. Philosophically, the text continues engaging questions about consciousness and meaning that resist resolution. Does meaning exist objectively or only through human interpretation? If the latter, what status should we grant our meaning-making when it constitutes such tiny portion of total reality? The Necronomicon doesn't answer these questions. It dramatizes them. It presents a scenario where human meaning-making confronts evidence of its own inadequacy. forcing readers to contemplate what remains if anthropocentric frameworks collapse. This thought experiment retains power regardless of one's philosophical commitments. The digital age's relationship with truth and fiction amplifies the book's relevance. Deepfakes, manipulated media, and information warfare demonstrate that distinguishing real from fabricated grows increasingly difficult. The Necronomicon pioneered aesthetic of deliberate ambiguity between fact and fiction that feels prescient in era of alternative facts and contested reality. When truth itself becomes slippery, a book that was always fictional but convinced people of its reality serves as perfect symbol for epistemological crisis afflicting contemporary culture. Psychologically, the text addresses universal experience of knowledge that damages rather than empowers. Most people encounter information they wish they could unlearn, traumatic events, disillusioning truths about people they trusted, evidence contradicting cherished beliefs. The Necronomicon literalizes this experience. What if knowledge existed that invariably harms the knower? What if understanding certain truths meant sacrificing the conceptual frameworks that make human life meaningful? These questions don't require belief in cosmic entities. They operate at level of everyday epistemological trauma. The book's treatment of time resonates in culture increasingly conscious of vast temporal scales. Geology and cosmology reveal durations that dwarf human history. Earth existed for billions of years before consciousness evolved, will continue billions more after life ends. This temporal insignificance produces affect similar to cosmic horror, the recognition that everything we consider important occupies negligible fraction of planetary or cosmic duration. The Necronomicon provided narrative vehicle for this recognition decades before it became commonplace through popular science. Perhaps most significantly, the text's endurance demonstrates human need for controlled encounters with the numinous. In secular age that's abandoned traditional religious frameworks without satisfying the appetites those frameworks addressed, cosmic horror provides alternative route to experiences of awe, terror, and confrontation with the incomprehensible. The Necronomicon offers these experiences without requiring theological commitment. It allows engagement with questions of ultimate significance. What exists beyond human understanding? What would revelation of cosmic truth do to human consciousness? In safely fictional register. The book thus functions as what anthropologists call liminal object, something that exists between categories and draws power from that betweenness. It's fiction that people treat as real, ancient text that was invented recently, dangerous knowledge that harms no one because it doesn't exist. These contradictions don't weaken its cultural force, they constitute that force. The Necronomicon works because it refuses to resolve into single stable meaning. What remains after nearly a century of accumulated interpretations, adaptations, and appropriations? A recognition that some of our deepest anxieties require mythological expression rather than rational analysis. The fear that consciousness might be accident, that knowledge might exceed our capacity to process it, that meaning might be local rather than universal, these concerns resist philosophical resolution. The Necronomicon doesn't solve them. It gives them form, narrative structure, and cultural persistence. It transforms abstract anxiety into concrete symbol that can be discussed, analyzed, reimagined, and transmitted across generations. The book will persist as long as people confront the possibility that human frameworks for understanding reality might be fundamentally inadequate to reality itself. This confrontation isn't historical artifact. its structural feature of consciousness capable of questioning its own relationship to what exists beyond it. The Necronomicon, the book that never was, continues being precisely because it addresses needs that never cease.